Well, we are now ready to dive into the pool and really take an in-depth look at this thing called religion, but from a biological perspective. And as always, we're going to be alluding to hope as having a relationship to religion, and in many senses to have been co-selected for, as was religion. So the ultimate goal here is to explain how having some sort of narrative that acknowledges the sacred would have been a driving force in human evolution. So we'll talk about it first in terms of there being an underlying tension, a conundrum, a pair of oppositional forces underscoring the evolution of religion. We'll propose a potential solution, and then we'll try to resolve the issue of how evolution may have created a religious sense in evolving man over the course of time. So if we think of modern day man, we immediately come to that conclusion that we are evolutionary chimeras. We address that as being stitched together from disparate parts in the same way that Frankenstein was. And if we look at our intellectual capacity, our emotional presentation, you'll be struck by how many contradictory notions our ideas are made of. So, for instance, we live in a Microsoft civilization, but we still have Stone Age emotions. We're still governed in many senses by our primitive limbic system. And the more civilized we get on the one hand, the more odd our Stone Age emotional mentality appears. We currently exist courtesy of medieval institutions. And I think we can take Congress as a useful example here in this country. Congress is simply not working, and its lack of function is not a mystery. It's because of basic human intransigence. But why does it persist? And why don't we people do something about it? Particularly when those medieval institutions are in possession of such immense power that includes the power to change people and the way they think, as well as whole environments. It's a conundrum. We, on any given day, may be confused about the mere fact of our existence, and also, at the same time, how our own species can pose such a rich and enduring apocalyptic danger to itself. We are, in many senses, our own worst enemy. Reference my comments on Congress. So we're godlike in our ambition and childlike in our understanding. And that nature, that human nature, that oppositional human nature, continues to haunt us even as our ability to understand increasing minutiae in the physical world is advancing apace. We can be intensely selfish. All of us have that capacity. And then, without batting an eyelid, we can be unexpectedly selfless. We have both capacities, which is a strange way to put a being together, to have polar opposites, polar ends of the spectra of various kinds of emotions. And so what I'm trying to get at is that we need some sort of framework to help us make sense of all of these conflicting and polar opposite or disparate features being part of one brain and one society. So if we go back to our hunter-gatherer friends, they too needed a way to understand all of these weird contradictions. And they had considerably less in the way of language richness to help them express their ideas, and also less of an ability to fundamentally analyze the contradictions and even gather data about them. How did that tribe down the road do this? I don't know. We don't talk to them. So they were hindered by their relatively primitive communication and language skills. and probably just fraught with the reality that they had very little time to sit around and leisurely think about these things. But nonetheless, they were driven by the imperative of survival, and that had constraints that reside not in philosophy or religion, but in biology. And those things had to be woven together into a coherent worldview. And as far as we can tell, they gave rise to an ethos that, with some variation, would become the human ethos. And if we adjust for culture and time and geography, we get to a fairly static repertoire of skills that humans possess. So we've seen that the hunter-gatherers, despite their primitive nature, were also complicated people, richly endowed with some of these competing interests that I've been alluded to. They had abandoned the way of their evolutionary cousins. Of course, they'd left the other great apes in the dust. We've lost a lot of the things that the great apes were known for. But even the early humans, the members of the human tribe that were not also members of the genus Homo, we abandoned all of that. And in our hunter-gatherer years and in our hunter-gatherer mode, they conquered 6 continents in less than 50,000 years. And when you consider having to circumnavigate the globe with very primitive modes of transportation, without a map, without knowing or understanding or anticipating the likely dangers that they would face, that is truly an amazing thing. So by the time we get to the hunter-gatherer, the major processes that took place to the bodies of humans as well as their minds became one of the drivers that led to our expansionist ideas and capacities. And also by that time, and very importantly, the nature of human society itself had changed profoundly. And among the major changes that had taken place relative to our other human forebears, and certainly in contrast to the other great apes, the alpha male had given leeway to a new system of egalitarianism in the hunter-gatherers. So gone were the hegemonic ways of old in which one member of the tribe presided and was the decision maker and meted out the resources and the punishments. In the hunter-gatherer mode, that whole philosophy was upended, and the society to which the hunter-gatherers belonged was egalitarian. And that new order it absolutely required new thinking and a new organization. So in addition to the egalitarianism, meaning that there was no favored individual, that all shared equally, not only in the resources but also in the workload, there was the development of cooperation as a primary mode of doing business. Less competition among members of a given tribe and much more cooperation within the tribe, because that allowed them to do all the incredible things that they did, like getting around the globe in less than 50,000 years. So the question is, once these desired modalities were hit upon, how best do we cement these characteristics in mankind? And it's a conundrum because often, not always, but often it requires that individuals work against their own best interest. It could be a short-term arrangement, but nonetheless, it requires that kind of self-sacrifice on behalf of individuals. And how do we get people to do that? But more importantly, how does evolution work to do that? And as we'll see in a minute, that is a particular problem. So as time played out for the hunter-gatherers, a number of social innovations took place in the hominid line that made the difference between, for instance, what the Neanderthals could do or Homo heidelbergensis could do and what Homo sapiens could do. There was a transitional period, which was fairly short in evolutionary terms, in which male dominance yielded to egalitarianism, and also we don't know whether this was sequential or at the same time or there was some back and forth or what. This is a time during which religion emerged among humans. Still, it's difficult to explain in an evolutionary context because among hunter-gatherer societies, one of the most pressing issues was how to get people to put group needs above those of the individual. And this is especially the case when individuals among the hunter-gatherers, and because of their really big brains, could produce new and potent skills, which included the fashioning of tools and weapons, the production of poisons, and that sort of thing. And if you are a fan of ancient history, you know that all of these skills were put to use in ways that we would consider nefarious, to not advance the interests of the group, but to pursue individual prowess. So during the hunter-gatherer times, there apparently was less of that. And the group was the unit that was revered and which people intended to make prosper, even if it was at the expense of the individual. Also, please remember that there is no alpha male to enforce the rules. So if people break the rules, what do? You still need enforcement of the rules, even if there's no big kahuna who is the heavy, who does the identification of the bad actors and exacts the punishment from them. Well, one of the compelling arguments about the birth of religion is that religion evolved and took root among early man because religion could fulfill the role of the punisher as one of the many things that religion does. Religion also provided a focus for human bonding, because what is religion if not the identification of shared common bonds and interests, which ultimately lead to the production of a well-defined ethos, a way of behaving because of an internalized set of beliefs. So to make that internalized set of beliefs known to others in the group, there would have been shared rituals, which included music and dance. We know that neurobiologically, these are things that lead to bonding. We'll talk about this in a neurobiological context later on. It's also the case that ancient people, and we presume hunter-gatherers, have, in general, a belief that dead ancestors, when they die, when they go away to that other place that most people believe exists once we die, that those dead ancestors nonetheless could still see into the heart and the motives of people yet on earth, yet living on earth. So the idea that there were dead ancestors out there watching your moves here on earth, and that those dead ancestors could exact punishment for your bad deeds after death, is a real fear. And if you interview people in modern indigenous tribes, you'll find precisely these kind of beliefs existing in the modern era. So this led to a fairly widespread understanding that there would be divine retribution for your transgressions on earth after death. And that, of course, would be a very potent organizing principle for your behavior during your time on earth. In addition, because of the insular nature of the tribes and their preference to commune with one another rather than to broadcast their attentions outside the tribe, the mores that were agreed upon and were followed and reinforced provided the necessary social fabric that would resist change, even in the face of energy to change from outsiders. And this, of course, would become the basis for group cohesion. The issue of punishment, though, is still one we must look at a little further, because punishment, while we all hate it, has to be enforced. We know that many of the human emotional behaviors that are designed to underscore religious behavior and the human ethos in general includes a variety of self-aware behaviors that we exhibit when we know that we've done something wrong, or when we feel sorry, or when we're simply interested in making sure that others are also following the same rules. We have developed this set of behavioral repertoire that teach us how to make sure that not only are we towing the correct line, but others are as well. So we have a human propensity for criticism. We've already talked about the human proclivity towards gossip as a way of spying on other people and making sure that the group knows and understands that that guy was a bad person and he did the following thing. That's the scorecard keeping that I mentioned. There's a lot of information sharing about people and the behaviors that they exhibit. And if you're behaving badly, you might broadcast that by showing signs of shame and things like blushing to indicate that you know you've done wrong. And in addition to having those behaviors, we know at the group level that one of the early modes of intervention by the group against somebody who's not behaving correctly is to shun them, to ostracize them, to make them live apart from the group, which can have, as we've said before, lethal consequences. But still, this is involvement of the group members in carrying out these enforcement activities, and that's always a little bit dicey in human society, because humans, particularly those humans who cherish and need cooperation in order to get by in the world, humans are reluctant to themselves mete out that punishment. So this was discussed in a very interesting paper by Johnson and Kruger entitled, cleverly, The Good of Wrath: Supernatural Punishment and the Evolution of Cooperation. So what they're arguing is that cooperation, which, as we've discussed many times, was the thing that undergirded the hunter-gatherers' success. They had to be able to act cooperatively. And that means that if you don't cooperate, if you shun that obligation, then you should be punished. But punishment itself is costly to those who carry it out. Let's say you are the punisher and you belong to the Brown family. And because you are the punisher, you have to punish somebody from the Green family. And you do that. You punish the erring member of the Green family. But now, his relatives in the Green family are going to be mad at you. And this is how blood feuds begin. And those are very well documented in history, and they're corrosive. It really does undermine cooperation. And as we've said a zillion times, cooperation is the mainstay of the hunter-gatherer life. So how do we accomplish this very important function of punishing wrongdoing without creating animus for the tribe members among each other? And that is why Johnson and Kruger argue that supernatural punishment is a way to skirt this problem by having a supernatural being do the punishment. The person who is wrong pays the price, but nobody in the group is stuck with the blame and the resentment for performing the punishment. So having a supernatural enforcer would deter defection from the right path and presumably represented an adaptive trait that was favored by selection. So now you begin to see how religious ideals could take root in the human mind, become inculcated in the behavioral repertoire, and be selected for by natural selection. We know from experiments, both ancient and modern, that punishment is required and is effective in melding society together. We know from modern experiments that If people who cheat are not punished, cooperation breaks down rapidly. And now in the hunter-gatherers, recall, you have to have cooperation or you cannot meet the demands of that world. Among economists and game theorists, they agree that cooperation emerges only if defectors are punished. And this creates a problem, a tension, if you will. A lot of people may cooperate in securing a public good, like agriculture or defense. So what I'm saying is a variety of people will behave relatively altruistically and will participate in the production of crops, for instance, or will participate in warding off predators, including other humans. So they are not unwilling to invest themselves in these activities, which are absolutely critical. They're willing to give of themselves. They are behaving in accordance with the group ethos. They are cooperating, but they still shy away from punishing people who don't do these things. And that lack of punishment is a severe problem because, as I've just indicated, cooperation disintegrates when defectors are not adequately punished. So punishment is essential, but there's either a lack of incentive or no incentive, a negative incentive for any one person in the group to do it. So Johnson and Kruger are arguing that having this supernatural being step in and do the punishment was a creative alternative to this very problem. So religion provided not only rules and taboos and norms of conduct that everybody was supposed to obey. These get codified into a general ethos, and they are underscored by all sorts of cultural entities like music, like dance, like body art, like poetry, like pictures. All sorts of things come together to underscore the need for cooperation and the need for punishment in securing that cooperation. So, if religion provided a threat of supernatural punishment in the next world, and if you also think your dead ancestors are up there watching and funneling information, perhaps to the deity, about your behavior in this world, it could be a real deterrent to bad behavior here on Earth. And it only requires that the living people have this as an internalized belief for it to be real and for it to entail consequences in this world. So, enforcement could be conducted by other humans here on Earth, but that would entail a cost that might be too great to pay. And therefore, having that punishment outsourced to a supernatural deity was an excellent solution to a thorny problem. So, when we talk about religion, whether it's the positive aspects of religion, like ensuring group cooperation and enhancing group cohesion, why would that be selected for? Well, here's the positive case for this view of religion. In essence, people who had this cooperation and this cohesion, people who felt as if they were getting a fair shake, that wrongdoers were punished, those people left more offspring. That's the simplest argument we can make, and one that we've been making all semester. Or we can defer to Jesse Baring, another researcher in this area, who said, quote, "We have inherited the general template for religiosity because those early humans who abandoned the prospect of supernatural agents or who lacked the capacity to represent their involvement in moral affairs likely met with an early death at the hands of their own group members, those who acquiesced to the possibility of moralizing gods and who led their lives in fear of such agencies survived to become our ancestors. Now, E.O. Wilson is back because he makes it clear that religion and tribalism were related, and in fact, they are very intertwined in Wilson's thinking, and that we probably would not have one without the other. He argues that religion was empowered by tribalism. As time went on, there were religious figures among the tribes, people like shamans and priests, whose job it was to be the intercessor between the divine world and the current one, and who became trusted to share the rituals and behaviors that were expected as being part of a religion that had a supernatural God. Religion also provided explanations for unknown things like where we go after we die, what happens to the soul, why does the body decay. These things were, of course, very scary to people back then because they didn't know. What is the eclipse about? What is at the end of the rainbow? They didn't know these things. And so having religion come in and fill that void was emotionally satisfying. Religions, almost all, provide some sort of creation myth to explain the origin of a particular tribe, and most of these creation myths argue or present the notion that that particular tribe is special, perhaps preferred by God or gods, and this gives folks a group identity that is very powerful. It also invokes a sense of belonging and the notion that you will be sheltered from random forces beyond one's control, which, of course, is something that all of us fear, even in the modern day. Wilson also made a connection between religion and hope, which, because of my interest in this course, I like to repeat to you. In Consilience, one of his several books, but the one which is a recitation about human behavior and the forces of evolution, he said, quote, "Religion arises from the innermost coils of the human spirit. It nourishes love, devotion, and above all, hope. People hunger for the assurance it offers." So this is an incredibly important quote. Religion comes from the spirit, and religion nourishes hope, without which people cannot live. People hunger for that assurance. They hunger for the hope. And that is why, one reason why, religion is so essential to most people. It creates a space for that hope, even when the evidence all around us is not hopeful. So it is a continuing form of assurance that this world is not necessarily our last, and as many of us know, the fear of death is one that is a persistent source of existential angst for many, many people. So, if humans need hope, and I do hope that at this juncture you understand that, even if you don't agree with it, then religion is a very natural consequence of needing that hope. Religion and hope are intimately entwined. One reinforces the other. And once religion took root, and this would have been done both through genetic and cultural mechanisms, religion itself became a motive force in the evolution of human society. Or, again referring to E.O. Wilson, who you know by now is one of my favorite authors, he put it, quote, "The human mind evolved to believe in gods. It did not evolve to believe in biology. Acceptance of the supernatural conveyed a great advantage throughout prehistory when the brain was evolving. Thus, it is in sharp contrast to biology, which developed as a product of the modern age and is not underwritten by genetic algorithms. Wow. Okay, so that really lays it out there. We believe in God because it's a matter of our genetics. Those folks who incorporated a supernatural deity into their understanding of the world left more children, and as a consequence, the genes for religious thinking became indoctrinated, became inculcated in the genome, and led to the production of more babies, leading to further increases in the frequency of those genes among evolving man. In contrast, our understanding of biology is, well, let's say, nascent. Many people have little understanding of biology at all, and many of those people have no desire to have an understanding of biology. But they probably have at least some exposure to religion and maybe an intense desire to know more about religion. And that is the difference between being genetically endowed and not genetically endowed. So I think this is an incredibly powerful statement. So let's review yet again what we mean when we say that hope and religion were created by the force of evolution. If we go back to our hunter-gatherer friends, they were able to cooperate, more able to cooperate among themselves. They had, as time went on and cooperation took root, a group system of achieving consensus. Those who are cooperative were more motivated to defend themselves against non-tribal members. Tribes who had religion did better in securing resources, and as a consequence, tribes with religion produced more offspring, and their genes were preferentially perpetuated in subsequent generations. Now we want to take up some complaints that real-life biologists have about the argument that religion was brought to us through natural selection. And the basic problem is that up to this point, we've been saying that the way evolution works is that it works at the level of the individual. So if an individual is in possession of a favored trait, and under the environment in which he or she is living, that trait is required or is an asset, it is clear that that person would probably have an advantage in securing resources and perhaps leave more children as a result. But the argument that's being made on behalf of religion as an evolutionary phenomenon is that the benefit accrues not to the individual, which is the understanding of the normal model of evolution, but rather to the group. And in fact, the individual can be sacrificed in the process. So that upends our understanding of how evolution works, and thus causes a problem for this argument, which depends on the notion that the value to the group comes from those sacrificing individuals who offer themselves up for the good of the group. And indeed, if you look at various religious doctrines, you'll find that self-sacrifice is often praised and exalted, and something that people recognize as being a really difficult and highly altruistic thing to do. But the problem with this as an evolutionary argument is that this self-sacrifice is an obvious disadvantage to the individual, even though the group benefits. But since the individual may be sacrificed, let's just say killed, as a result of the sacrifice, his or her genes will not go on to future generations. So how could this be a trait that was selected for by evolution? Well, if we go back again to the argument that religion was very important in making the hunter-gatherers who they were, because it helped them cement group cohesion, and this was done in part by using supernatural punishment. But at the same time, we have to recognize that this argument requires substantial sacrifice on the part of individuals. And that, of course, reduces the resources available to individuals and would ultimately lead to those individuals not contributing to the gene pool in the future. In other words, they have been selected against, so how can genes for self-sacrifice be perpetuated when the person performing the self-sacrifice is probably eliminated from the gene pool? Well, let's recall that in addition to encouraging altruistic individuals to sacrifice themselves, often in a lethal way, there are other aspects of religion that are not this draconian and that in fact are very positive in their outlook. So things like redemption and the notion that good behavior will be rewarded and the possibility that there's an afterlife, a place to which we can go after we die, these are all things that are good without the kind of cost that altruism exacts. So we have a number of carrots to offer with religion, but many people think that they're not enough because, for one thing, it encourages some people to cooperate, but it does not prevent all of them from cheating. So the rewards will contribute to cooperation, but the rewards are insufficient by themselves to ensure it. As a result, most religions will have well-documented punishments presented in their religious texts to remind people that, somebody else is watching and we're writing down all the bad things you're doing and you're going to have to account for them sometime down the line. So we have that as a problem. And now let's get really specific about the evolutionary problems with the general argument that religion can be selected for as a matter of natural selection. Two very eminent, very well-known, very respected biologists have entered that fray. They are the philosopher Steven Pinker and the very well-known, renowned, and oft hated Richard Dawkins. They have argued that religion cannot be an evolutionary advantage. And so they have advanced three arguments about why this cannot be so. The first is that, yes, religion can be a source of comfort in facing the inevitability of one's death, but they ask, how could this increase reproduction? Second, they argue that, yes, religion sponsors things like, community clam bakes where the people bring lime jello and they all have dinner together. That's nice. And they say a prayer and they do some dancing, some singing, and everybody feels good. So that's nice, and that's not deniable. But these same things could be achieved by other means. And certainly non-religious groups are known to do this as well, so it doesn't require religion to bring people together in a community to have a nice time with each other. The third argument is that religion is ostensibly a source of moral values, but animals have at least nascent moral values as well, and they do it without religion. They also note that there's a lot of violence and amorality in divine texts, and they offer up the Bible as an example. So, can we dismiss the Pinker-Dawkins arguments against considering religion to be the product of evolution? So if we start with the reality that the fact that we can comprehend our own mortality, does that comprehension by its own nature increase or decrease or have no effect on how many children that we have? Some people will say, you know what, the world is a terrible place. I don't want to bring children into it. But I think, honestly, more people would say, yep, the world is a nasty place. Life is often very difficult. But you know what? Children redeem it. Children are beautiful. I want children to be in my life while I'm here. And so I'm going to have some children. And in fact, most of us will do that. Besides which, there's a pervasive notion, and this is certainly advanced in most religious texts, that in your afterlife, you're reunited with your children, so you get to see them later. So there may be that separation at death, but that separation is temporary, and therefore, religion and having children are very compatible and are ways to believe that there's more to life than just the here and now and just the potential for having an afterlife that reunites you with your children is a compelling reason for religion and the begetting of children to be connected. So we can probably dismiss this argument. What about the second argument, which was just because group cohesion could have arisen by religion, it doesn't mean that it did, because there are other means by which it could have arisen. We know that the hunter-gatherer lifestyle needed some sort of organizing principle, and there are lots of desirable traits like trust and hope and loyalty, and these can certainly find a home in religion and can prosper from religion. We know that a belief in a punitive God was effective in creating a group ethos, in encouraging people to act collectively and cooperatively, and also to encourage people to forego their own self-interest. And ultimately, if we do not agree that natural selection produced religion, or was a factor in producing religion, and that religious behavior is not adaptive, we have to ask and answer the question of why it is universal. Even Dawkins will admit that the universality of religion cries out for a Darwinian explanation. He's just unwilling to give voice to it. What about the third argument, which is that animals have moral values or moral capacities without having religion? But this really only reinforces the notion that there are evolutionary roots for morality, and that this strand runs from animals to humans. So animals can engage in mutual aid and fairness and generosity and reciprocity and compassion and empathy. And while animals don't have the capacity to engage in type 2 morality, they do engage in type 1 morality. So religion would not be expected in animals because they can't speak and because they can't engage in type 2 morality. But we know that morality itself is an evolutionary phenomenon with distinct evolutionary and genetic roots, so it simply makes sense to believe that the incorporation of moral principles and the codification in religion, which is uniquely human, also enjoys this genetic and evolutionary heritage. So here's a possible resolution for the ostensive conflict, and that is group selection. We need to address the question of how religion evolved if religious behavior is not itself adaptive. Religion is a social behavior that exists to benefit a group. And as I said earlier, that's the problem. We need to understand how the sacrifice of an individual and the elimination of that individual from the breeding gene pool, even if it confers a benefit to the group, could result in the perpetuation of those genes for altruism. Biologists haven't reached consensus on the issue of whether group selection is real or not. Wilson says absolutely it is. Others say no, it's not. And a lot of them are doing complicated mathematics to try to resolve the argument one way or another. So if an individual behaves in a way that benefits the group, And in the process, he puts himself at a disadvantage and lowers his reproduction. How could this be construed as evolutionarily advantageous? Now, Darwin thought that group selection was indeed a possibility. He believed that evolution could favor a group even at the expense of individuals. Darwin said, a single religious man in a group would have very little advantage. So if there were only one religious person in a whole group of unreligious persons, the one religious man or woman would have very little advantage. However, if there were lots of religious people in a group, then the entire tribe could be advantaged and could enjoy greater reproduction than less religious tribes. So selection is taking place entirely at the group level. We're not talking about one person within a tribe being advantaged, or in this case disadvantaged. We're comparing levels of prosperity between groups where one is now religious and the other group is not religious. So what Darwin says that, in short, a group of highly motivated, intensely patriotic, intensely faithful, loyal, and courageous people, as in its best modality religions can engender, that would be a much more effective group. It would be much more effective at cooperating and much more effective at fighting other forces than a group that didn't have those characteristics. So even if individuals within the group perish, the group still gains in the end. And if non-religious tribes are ultimately vanquished, then religious genes will move forward and increase in the future. So that's the heart of the group selection argument. Other folks, in addition to E.O. Wilson, one of which is David Sloan Wilson, the two Wilsons, believe that humans are governed by different selective forces than are other animals. And as a consequence, they believe that humans are more strongly affected by group selection than any other species. They note that there's fierce pressure to conform, or there was among the hunter-gatherers, and this fierce pressure to conform to the norms of society would reduce the cost of altruism to individuals. They also noted that intense warfare between human groups accelerated the rate of group selection. And this would be an example of how selection was operating differentially on two different groups, one of which was endowed with religious faculties, the other was not. And the propensity to have massive amounts of hostilities between tribes is pretty well documented and understood. So under this selective pressure, there would be some demonstrable winners and losers, and if the winners were religious, and that religion in part created the success that they enjoyed, then you could see where, pretty much as Darwin said 150 years ago, we could get religion arising as a matter of natural selection. In addition, some of the negative traits, like selfishness in humans, would be limited by the egalitarian nature of hunter-gatherer society. People would simply be taught to share. They'd be taught to cooperate, and this would reduce the amount of selfishness and self-focus, at least among the hunter-gatherers. So conformity would reduce variability. If variability is reduced, it's possible for genes to go to fixation. Some of those genes could be religious in nature or be the source of religious behavior. But the important point is that between group variability in religious propensities are the driver of this evolutionary change. And the success of the hunter-gatherer societies and their ability to circumnavigate the globe in a very short period of time is evidence that they did this rapidly and they did this successfully, that they were driven in part by these behavioral traits that include religion. We also know, and this is now a tip of the hat to the discussion we began with, the chimeric nature of mankind, we know that the capacity for altruism co-evolved with our propensity to be warlike. They were flip sides of the same coin. But there was a disparity in how these traits were exercised. Altruistic behaviors were directed more towards the members of one's own group, one's own tribe, whereas violence and warfare was more often directed at those outside the tribe and who were perceived as threats to the tribe and its favored group identity. And so this is a very neat explanation for the list of opposite behaviors that we began this discussion with. Why are we so, we have these competing qualities that are mirror opposites of each other, but they're housed in the same human body. How is that the case? Well, they were both selected for, and they were selected for different reasons. But because we have these contrasting characteristics as part of our genetic heritage, we are equally capable of altruism and intense selfishness at the same time. That's just how we're made. And indeed, successful hunter-gatherers were capable of both of these disparate kinds of traits. And history is the record now of their success. And here is your study guide for hope as a progenitor of religion and the selective advantage of a sacred narrative.